this is our poor, unfortunate protagonist Jason. Jason went in to have minor surgery aboard one of the best equipped and most advanced hospital starships in the galaxy. 20 minutes under general anaesthetic and he'd be back home the same day. Waking up naked in an escape pod, hurtling towards the desolate planet on the edges of known space, was not how he expected his day to go. Upon landing on the glacial hellscape, he knew he had to act fast to avoid freezing to death. Spotting some steel embedded in a nearby mountain, he began working to free it so that he could construct a shelter. Thankfully, he was quite skilled at mining, unlike everything else. Jason chose to build his shelter around a nearby steam vent in the planet's crust, which would provide the vital heat that his useless skin was allowing to rapidly slip away. By the time Jason began to erect the shelter, his hands were already feeling numb from the biting cold, making construction difficult. Following the completion of his shelter, Jason decided that the next most important task was to clean the mud off the nearby glacier. His survival instincts could do with some work. Taking a moment to warm himself in his hut, Jason surveyed his surroundings, taking note of a nest of insectoids in a nearby cave. Although extremely dangerous, their hives were known to produce an edible jelly which just might keep him alive, if he could obtain it. Jason elected to expand his little hovel, utilising the walls of a nearby ruin to expand without using too many resources. As Jason was trying to get some rest, he heard an almighty crash as a transport pod crashed nearby. Looking across the water, he saw an emu had crashed down on the planet. Jason would have loved to save the emu, however he had no food for himself, never mind an animal, so he took a different course of action. Now, you may think that this seems like quite a small portion of meat to receive from a creature so large as an emu, and you would be correct. The reality is that Jason wasn't able to contain himself, and immediately upon reaching the bird, he began to tear into it with his teeth, leaving little left behind to butcher. The horrifying predicament that Jason found himself in caused him to have a crisis of belief, leaving him in a daze. Thankfully, even in his dazed state, he managed to return to his hovel before he could freeze to death. However, this unexpected display of survival instinct soon gave way to his hunger, and, unable to control himself, he dived headfirst into the southern insect cave to steal their jelly. Seemingly the sight of the hideous beasts snapped him out of his daze, allowing him the mental wherewithal to escape unnoticed while the creatures slept. Sadly, while out mining more steel, his lack of survival instinct struck again, causing him to not notice the cold until he had developed frostbite so severe that he lost a toe. A couple of traders happened to stop by, and, in the hopes of being able to purchase some clothes, Jason stockpiled his steel to sell to them. Sadly, the traders were not interested in purchasing steel, and they seemed to have very little reaction to seeing a naked man trapped in such an inhospitable environment. Jason consoled himself by using some of the stockpiled steel to build himself a proper bed, along with some furniture to spruce up his hovel. The sound of another transport pod crashing nearby brought Jason out of his daydream. This time, it was a man named Arcadius who had crashed. Jason still had no source of food for himself, let alone for another human, so he left Arcadius to bleed to death in the frozen waste. Arcadius was spared the same fate as the emu, however, for now at least. Jason wanted to close the door to his hovel in order to provide him with some protection from anyone who may wish him ill, but to do so he would first need to increase the size of it, so that the steam from the heat vent didn't simply cook him alive in the small room. His initial expansion proved to be too small to allow for the heat to dissipate properly, so he constructed yet another expansion to his hovel. As Jason slept, two rats, driven rabid by infection, entered the area, intent on feasting upon him. With no clothes to protect him, Jason decided he could at least arm himself and fashioned himself a crude knife out of some of his steel. He opened the door and made quick work of the rats, dispatching them each with a single stroke, suffering only minor scratches in return. He decided to hide the bodies of the rats behind the ruins of a nearby ancient tank. Out of sight, out of mind. The infection that the rats were suffering from meant that they were not safe to consume, so Jason had to make a daring run past the sleeping insectoids to steal some more of their jelly to sustain himself. After the danger of the rats, Jason invested a small portion of his steel in a trap to deter any future attackers. Having constructed a crude research bench, Jason decided to begin his exploration of modern science. He would need all the knowledge he could to survive, Sadly, in this endeavour, he elected to ignore the study of renewable energy, which would have provided him with electricity required to heat his hovel, and instead focused his energy on researching lamps, devices which would be useless to him without the electricity to power them. For a period of time, Jason continued to research, stealing away into the northern caves to gather insect jelly when he could, to satiate his hunger. Given the dangers inherent in trying to steal insect jelly, and the fact that his hovel has a section of dirt flooring, Jason decided to try and grow nutrifungus on the floor. It was a disgusting plant that would be horrible to consume, but it was the only thing he could grow without the sun, and anything he grew outside would freeze immediately. As the year wore on, winter began to approach, seeing temperatures drop outside to around negative 35 degrees. The hovel was now too big for the steam vent alone to maintain a safe temperature, so Jason decided to wall off the section with the nutrifungus. This would help maintain the temperature in the main section of the hovel, but would unfortunately mean that the nutrifungus would freeze and stop growing. Finishing his research into the almighty lamp, Jason finally realised the need for electricity and began working on understanding renewable energy sources so that he could build a wind turbine. Another transport pod crashed nearby. Given how many were coming down, he began to wonder if they were all from the same ship as himself. Tola, the occupant of this pod, was even less fortunate than Arcadius had been. In his desperation for protection from the elements, Jason stripped her of her clothes and left her to freeze to death. Her clothes provided little protection from the cold, but anything was better than his bare skin. Progressing with his research, Jason finally felt ready to build a prototype wind turbine. Unfortunately, his construction skills weren't that great, and he repeatedly failed in his attempts, wasting precious mechanical components. As the temperatures outside continued to fall, now at a brisk negative 45, Jason reduced the size of his hovel once more to ensure that it could maintain a safe temperature. On his third attempt, he successfully constructed the prototype wind turbine, finally providing power for a small heating unit to complement the efforts of the steam vent. Another day, another crashed transport pod, this time carrying a fluffy little llama called Salty. Isn't he cute? He was very tasty. With the added warmth from the electric heater, Jason decided to place a vent leading between the main section of the hovel and the mushroom chamber, in the hopes that he could heat the mushroom chamber enough to encourage their growth. This task became extra important mere moments later when he looked to the north and saw that at negative 65 degrees, the cold had become so extreme that it had destroyed the nest of the insectoids. There would be no more jelly. Jason was on a timer to start growing his own food. He collected up the last of the jelly and captured some of the incapacitated insectoids, choosing to butcher them for their disgusting slimy meat. It wouldn't be great, but it would be enough to let him survive a while longer. The ridiculous cold also meant that the hovel was not able to maintain a safe temperature, so he added a second electric heater, this time in the mushroom chamber. With a nearby steel deposit exhausted, and the next nearest being too far to traverse in the extreme cold, Jason began tunnelling towards the next deposit through his hovel, reducing the time he would need to spend in the cold to reach it. With more steel secured, Jason finally indulged in his love of lamp, and produced a light source for the hovel. Another transport pod crash, this time carrying a wolf person named Mila. Mila had brought warmer clothes than Tola. Mila suffered the same fate. Sporting his fancy new jacket, Jason completed his research into the renewable energy sources and began working on designing a battery. He was currently at the whims of the wind, but if he could create a battery, then he could store some of the excess energy during high winds to draw when winds were low. Things were getting desperate. Jason's supply of insect meat and jelly had run dry, and his nutrifungus was still a ways off being ready to harvest. As it turns out, Tola's clothes were not her only gift to Jason. He dragged her corpse from behind the tank to begin consuming it. Of course, he did so at the dining table. He was no monster after all. Despite eating at the table, Jason still didn't quite love eating human meat. Jason soon felt comfortable building a prototype battery. With his storage system in place, he would be unlikely to have to turn the heaters off ever again, finally achieving a safe and stable temperature in the hovel. Still hungry, Jason collected what remained of Tola and consumed every last piece. After all, it's important not to leave evidence of one's crimes. In an effort to become self-reliant, and to stop eating human corpses, Jason began cutting bricks from stone to build an extension to the hovel, encompassing a larger area of dirt in which he could grow more nutrifungus. A raider from the poison packers approached Jason's hovel, looking to steal what they could. Thankfully, the extreme cold that had plagued Jason's time here finally worked in his advantage, causing the raider to succumb to hypothermia long before they could approach the hovel. Realising that the slow growth of the neutrofungus meant he could not rely on it for sustenance, even if he expanded the mushroom chamber, Jason instead focused his attentions on his research, looking to science for an answer. After completing his research into batteries, he began studying how to make a hydroponics basin. Such a thing would allow him to grow conventional crops with great speed, just at the cost of a lot of electricity. In the meantime, however, Jason continued to feast on the corpses that had rained from the sky. Mila was up next. However, Mila took their revenge, smiting Jason with food poisoning as he consumed the last bite of them. Other raiders, who had frozen in their attempts to lay waste to the hovel, lay strewn across the area. Jason began to collect them too, and hide them behind the military tank of questionable meats. With the completion of his first prototype hydroponics basin, he planted some rice, finally putting some of his horticultural skills to good use. As he was looking to increase the hydroponics output, there was a bit of an electrical fire. Perhaps building an electrical grid out of prototypes wasn't the best plan after all. Thankfully, Jason got the fire under control before any real damage could be done. Wanting to utilise as much of the sun lamp's rays as possible, and having given up on growing the neutrofungus, Jason rearranged the hovel, turning the mushroom chamber into his bedroom, and even building himself some new furniture too. On the 3rd of April, over 3/4 of a year after he crashed here, Jason finally harvested his first crop of rice. It wasn't much, and he would need to up the production quantities fast, but he was proud of his accomplishment. And hungry. So hungry in fact that he couldn't resist chewing down a few handfuls of uncooked rice as soon as it was harvested. With the warmer clothes courtesy of those falling from the sky, and the rising temperatures as summer approached once again, Jason was able to make the long journey to the southern caves to grab the insects who had lain dormant there, collecting them to be butchered back in the hovel. A new challenge had presented itself. There were no more mechanical components in the area that Jason could see. In an effort to find more, he expanded the mine at the back of the hovel. In the first piece of real luck since landing, he found a small vein of components right at the back of the tunnel. A raider from the Backfay tribe approached, interrupting Jason's attempts to expand his farm. Jason had become a little too comfortable in his life in the hovel though, and chose to simply ignore the raider, instead heading back from some mining to enjoy a meal of insect meat and then get into his bed. As he slept, the raider fell right into his trap. Finally finishing up his research into hydroponics, Jason decided to begin to try to understand solar panels. The sun lamp was using a lot of electricity, but it only required power during the day. He thought that by using a solar panel, he could counter the sun lamp's power requirements. Unfortunately, Jason hadn't considered the fact that, as far north as he was on the planet, weeks could go by without any real sunlight, rendering a solar panel next to useless. This realisation caused him to have a bit of a mental break and hide in his room. And with that, the 1st of August arrived once more, marking 1 year since Jason had crash landed. Although he was still a long way to make it back to civilization, we see out the first year of Jason's ordeal in a very fitting manner, with a mental break and a little light cannibalism. Hello there wonderful people, it's Tuna here. Just wanted to say if you made it this far, thank you very much. This is my first attempt at making YouTube content, so it's been a bit of an adventure, but I'm loving it so far. That said, I still have a lot to learn, which I do hope to do as I continue to make more videos. If you have any constructive feedback on the video, please do leave it down in the comments, as it will be invaluable to me as I try to develop my skills and my own content style. Also, if you'd like me to continue Jason's journey back to civilization, let me know. With that, I shall leave you to enjoy this short time lapse of the development of Jason's base over the course of this video.